In today's installment, we hear Timothy describe the aftermath of the near rioting, if not actual rioting, in Ephesus over Paul's preaching that there is one and only one God, and that Artemis is not that. Hear the voice of Timothy. Paul sits in prison, blaming no one. I'm the one who feels a bitterness. I'm the one with blame in my heart. God forgive me, for if Aristarchus had left well enough alone, nobody would be in prison now. But after the riot in the theater, after the city clerk had forced the silversmiths to release him, Aristarchus followed the clerk's advice, as though the clerk had been talking to him, and immediately brought formal charges against Demetrius. This infuriated Demetrius. It also persuaded the silversmith to attack Aristarchus and Paul, less publicly, under cover of darkness. I'm convinced that even this situation wouldn't have landed Aristarchus and Paul in prison if it had been just the two of them. They might have been beaten, but they'd still be free. However, when Demetrius and his gang of longshoremen surprised Paul and Aristarchus in a narrow street in the night, they were not alone. Epaphras was with them. Epaphras made the difference. This man fights like one of those bear shirters out of the frozen north, screaming, kicking, striking, biting all at once. There's no time for surprise in him. Touch him, and he's already pounding you. And so it was that night. Demetrius and one other man accosted Paul and Aristarchus and Epaphras face to face in the narrow space between stuccoed walls. The five of them, it seemed, were at an impasse, blocking each other's way. But Epaphras detected the slightest motion behind them, felt the slightest breath upon his neck, and went crazy. 3 more men were lurking there. In a flash, Epaphras was a street dog fighter, a blur of terrible speed, bellowing, cursing, causing longshoremen to cover their heads as if the bees were stinging them. He'll hit anywhere, tear anything, scratch like a cat, drum and drum a human skull till its brains are porridge. And all the while, he'll produce such a savage hullabaloo that the poor fool who attacked him thinks the sky is raining devils. All but one of the longshoremen fled. That one lay bleeding on the ground, scarcely breathing. Demetrius, too, was immobile with pain. Fingers on both his hands were broken. Craft had been wrenched from the silversmith's hands and would never return. When soldiers appeared, dispatched from the praetorium to investigate what beasts were screaming in Ephesus, Demetrius, filled with pain and fury, finally got his wish. Epaphras and Aristarchus and Paul were all taken to prison to await trial, possibly for murder. These days, hatred has swelled in the city. Hatred for Paul in particular. The blood of the innocent shed in his name, says the rabbi, the gossiping population. All at once, Ephesus is convinced that Paul has been busy creating a subversive secret sect among them. 1,000 here, 10,000 in Asia. Everyone knows him by sight. You can't miss the man. They read his character in his skinny form, and having heard of his imprisonment, they say, "I knew it." Sometimes I think fewer people would detest my friend if he were a prettier man, as tall and strong as that other Saul, the Benjaminite, the king of Israel. And if he spoke with a honey tongue, how then would the gospel, in a world that judges by the eye and ear alone? But his voice His voice grates on the ear like the rims of cymbals rubbed together. People don't forget the effect of little Paul preaching, whether or not they stop to fathom the language. But because some people do stop, do understand, and do follow this little ferret of a preacher, Ephesians detesting has turned to downright fear. What magical power does he possess? So it's more than the craftsmen who hate Paul. And more powerfully than the common citizenry, it's the priests of Artemis. They themselves fear him as a sorcerer, able to suck the very soul from their votaries. And they fear a sect of people so heedless of the Artemisian traditions that, growing in size and might, it could jeopardize their authority, their financial affairs, their banking ability, their keeping and lending of monies. Paul sits in a windowless cell, blaming no one. His wrists are manacled, chained to the wall. He can neither stand fully upright nor lie flat down. All the other prisoners move about together in a greater room. He's the only one bound alone in a silent cell. In the lowest regions of the Praetorium, Paul sits on the stone floor of his cell without blame and without joy. I serve him. I take him food. I take dictation for his letters. I strive to console him, and I fail. He wept while he uttered an angry letter for the churches at Corinth. When, as a portion of that letter, I wrote the words, "A thorn was given me in the flesh," I wondered whether his flesh were the thorn, this physical form that so offends the world. Titus is carrying that letter of tears the long way round to Achaia. Daily, Paul says to me, "Is there news yet? What's the news? What have you heard of Titus? What does he say from the Corinthians?" I serve Paul. The guards recognize me. They allow me to come and go. I take Paul the news. I tell him that the man struck down in the streets, the longshoreman whose head Epaphras had cracked, that man is dead. Paul sighs and rubs his eyes with the heels of his hands and heaves a yet more heavy sigh. Not because the charge has changed to murder, but rather because the man is dead. Oh, Timothy, how do you think it goes in Corinth? What is my letter doing to them now? We lost the Galatians. How could we lose the Corinthians too? Paul sits in prison, utterly, unbearably crushed. To me, it seems that he's despairing of life itself.